Hey everybody. So today's video is going to be about cognitive biases, which are just biases that humans can have that affect the way that they think about things in a way that is probably going to be not very helpful. And a lot of these biases are very common and they have sort of evolutionary explanations. Now this video I'm going to be talking about them, but specifically I'm going to be discussing how toxic I think they are if a friend was to have that bias. So to add a little twist on the video, we're going to go through these cognitive biases, and then I'm going to be doing a tier list, which I have here, where I discuss how toxic I think each bias would be if a friend had it. So the very top ranking is going to be extremely toxic, meaning if a friend portrayed this bias a lot of the time, I would probably find it quite hard to even be their friend, all the way down to completely fine, which is like, it really doesn't affect me, or it won't affect the friendship if they had this bias a lot. Now keep in mind that this ranking is not going to be about how bad or detrimental I think the bias actually is, or how common I think it is. It's just how toxic I think a friendship would be if the friend was always exhibiting this bias. Alright, so without further ado, let's start things off with the anchoring bias. Now, the anchoring bias is about when the first thing you judge has extra weight to how you perceive a situation, and you're more likely to make that first judgment influence other judgments a lot of the time. So let's say, for example, someone goes to a city for the first time, and they don't really know anything, but they notice a weird pattern. Maybe they notice some strange music is playing that they haven't heard before. And then they immediately assume that, like, you know, this city must be just playing weird music all the time. And now next time they hear music, they're going to try and convince themselves the music is weird because they've anchored this position that this is a city with weird music, something like that. That isn't really a good example, but you get the basic idea. Car salesmen know a lot about the anchoring bias because when they give you your initial offer, which is usually going to be a far higher price than what they're actually willing to come down to, that's going to anchor your brain and set a precedent for what kind of prices you should accept. So people in negotiating rooms know a lot about anchoring biases and how to exploit the other person's anchoring bias. Now, in a friend, I'm not really too fussed on this, honestly, so I'm just going to put this in not a huge deal. I can't really think of how this would affect a friendship in a really bad way. Alright, the next one is the sunk cost bias, or better known as the sunk cost fallacy. So this is about when you want to keep doing something, even though it's not really paying dividends to you anymore, just because you put so much effort into it. So the sunk cost fallacy is the kind of fallacy that makes you want to finish your degree, even though you don't think you're going to even need the degree, just because you're in your third or fourth year and you might as well finish it. A really cool way to think about the sunk cost fallacy is that it's a fallacy that makes you stay for a really bad movie just because you've already bought the popcorn. You sit in the theater, you think, I'm wasting my time here, this movie is not good at all, but I bought the popcorn. I'm kind of priced in a way, I should probably just finish it. So yeah, sunk cost is a very common fallacy. Now, where should I rate it for a friendship? I'm going to say it is somewhat toxic because I guess I could be worried that friendships or friends might see me as a sunk cost. It's like, if a lot of people I think have a tendency to cling to their friendships just because the friendships have legacy. Maybe you've known each other from high school, you've been friends for a decade or whatever. And a lot of people assume that this means inherently you probably should keep the friendship going because you have so much investment into that person. But in actuality, and this sucks to say, but like people do change, and maybe we shouldn't see people as a sunk cost. So I'm going to put the sunk cost fallacy as somewhat toxic just because I think it might make people not aware of how much they value their friends. And that can be quite toxic. Alright, next one is going to be the confirmation bias. This is where you look for things that support your existing belief. So a really easy example of this is, imagine we have a person here and there's a box of marbles. Let's say 4 of them, most of them are red, some of them are blue. And this guy has a preconceived notion that most of the marbles are blue, right? So he's going to say most are blue. Now this person wants evidence for that. And let's say that he can't see in the box. Maybe it's covered up, right? It's evidence. And then this guy is going to put overemphasis on these 2 marbles. He's seeking something that proves the claim he's already made. Confirmation biases are really, really common, especially when it comes to politics and echo chambers. So people will actively seek out information or seek out media that confirms a political belief that they already have. And this is a really huge problem. It's something I've talked about in another video. And I think I might do a full video on echo chambers because they are really fascinating. And the way they work are really fascinating. I think this is a pretty toxic thing to have, a confirmation bias. I like to sort of debate with my friends a lot. We have a lot of silly arguments about stuff. Not really in a way that's too confrontational, but it can bother me when I think that my friends aren't really engaging with what I'm saying in a fair way. And a lot of the time I feel like it is down to this bias. So I'm actually going to put this as very toxic to have a confirmation bias in a friendship. You want to be redeemable in the eyes of your friends, and it can be really hurtful when you feel like they're just looking for reasons to, fulfill some kind of narrative that they've already formed about you. So I'm going to put this in very toxic, and we'll move on. So the next one is the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is, I suppose, a pretty common bias. I work a bit in education, so I probably see this quite a bit myself. The Dunning-Kruger effect basically describes the relationship between your knowledge, I'm just going to say the info you have on a topic, and your confidence. And basically the idea is that if you don't know much, you're going to have very high confidence because you don't know what you don't know. You might assume that you're like an expert at something because you haven't actually seen how complicated the topic can get. This is a very common thing in math where, high schools will come out of math class and think they're really good at math, and they do like maybe a university course and they realize that, there's a lot I don't know. And that can be very humbling. The Dunning-Kruger effect has a curve that has a very iconic shape. I think it's something like this. And this is the basic relationship between information and confidence. So if you're here on the Dunning-Kruger effect curve, this is like peak ignorance. This is somebody who doesn't really know that much, but they haven't got to that point yet where they're aware of their shortcomings. They can't see all the information ahead of them. So the person here thinks they're really good at the topic, and they're not that good at the topic. And then as they slowly learn more, their confidence actually decreases because they start learning more about what they don't know. And I think this point here is known as the cultured point. If you're completely cultured on a topic, you have a lot of respect for the people ahead of you. You see these people as true pros because you sort of understand what it takes to be one of them. This can happen a lot in like chess players. You see a lot of people they're not quite a grandmaster, but they're really good at chess. They have a lot of respect for the people who made it over here because you know how much it takes. And then as you start learning more and more, you become a pro. You start to slowly climb this curve again. And then these people are like the experts. Their confidence is raised again. They do have high confidence, but they're right to have high confidence. They actually do know a lot about the info, unlike the ignorant people over here. So how does this relate to friendships? I think it's quite toxic, I think, when someone assumes they know everything. Just, or has just an overconfidence in what they say. I think typically, like personally, I actually quite respect overconfidence. If someone says something with a lot of confidence, I think, damn, this person's sort of standing on business or whatever. I find this whole wishy-washy, you don't want to tell me what you want to, get for dinner, I have to decide it all myself. I find that sort of lack of confidence a bit more frustrating, but I don't know if I'd say toxic. I think it just stems from people being shy. But having an overconfidence is also quite toxic. I think I'm going to put this in very toxic. The next one is declinism, which is to do with seeing the past as better than it was and assuming the future will be worse. So this is like, looking back with the rose-tinted glasses. This is a very common thing, I think, in fascist thought, where everyone's going to really idolize about 30 years ago. And, a lot of fascist thinkers will always appeal to, restating a great past that has been stolen from us. I'm not saying that people who practice declinism are going to be, like, politically fascistic or anything like that. But this is a big thing. The problem with a lot of declinist philosophy now is that I think a lot of them probably are actually right. We can see a lot of measurable ways that our world is getting worse. Gas prices, the AI stuff, everyone's on a vape now. There are a lot of very obvious reasons why the world's getting worse. But we didn't see how bad it was back in the day. And I think we often we'll forget how a lot of things have gotten better, and maybe we should just, count our blessings a little bit. Declinism is very pessimistic, and it will probably lead to like people being more depressed, things like this. But in a friend, I don't think it's that toxic. I actually enjoy talking to friends who have narratives like this because I find the conversations really interesting. So I'm actually going to say this is completely fine. I'm not bothered at all by a friend looking back at the past in this way. Cool. The next one is the just world hypothesis, which is basically where your preference for a just world makes you assume that it exists or presume that it can exist. So you talk to a lot of people, they'll say things like, well, in an ideal world, this wouldn't happen. And a very common response to that is, well, we don't live in an ideal world. But they really want to live in an ideal world, and so they're going to form opinions based on what it would mean to live in this ideal world. A good example of this is in like voting. So I feel like people who like maybe don't vote because they don't like either candidate, but one candidate's probably clearly way worse than the other candidate. Let me actually draw a chart for this. Let's say that this person here is, let's say he's relatively right wing, for example. I'm going to use blue for right wing because in New Zealand our right wing party is blue. So sorry if that's confusing to Americans. And we have a political spectrum here. I'm not trying to take any sides here. I'm just trying to give the example. So this is right and this is left. This person's a bit on the right. And there are two major political parties. One is about here. One is about here. And they get to pick one. But their political opinions, they're very, very right wing. Their sort of ideal point would be like around here, right? Very far to the right of the spectrum. And this person might not vote, or abstain. I won't vote. And this person's friends, maybe friends who are slightly less right wing, friends who are maybe in this region, might say, are you crazy? Why won't you vote? Because these left wing people are more likely to win. Just cast your vote for the lesser of two evils. We hear this a lot, the lesser of two evils. And they might end up saying something like, well, in an ideal world, I wouldn't have to vote for a party that I don't perfectly align with. And it's like, we don't live in an ideal world. And in a way, this is a bias. In friendships, I'm not too bothered. It can be frustrating talking to someone who sort of seems to have this framework that everything can just be solved and every problem has a solution. I think we need to accept that some things do just suck. And for that reason, I think a lot of political conversation probably needs to be about reform and not revolution. But that's a whole other video. I'm going to say this is just not a huge deal. I'm not too bothered by the just world hypothesis. The next one is the framing effect, which is very straightforward. It's just falling for things differently based on how they're framed. So it's a very famous thing in statistics, how statistics can be misleading. If I'm trying to, make people feel like, I don't know, smoking is really bad for you, which I believe it is. Let's say 30% of people have health problems. Well, let's say 31% of people later in life have issues with smoking, health-related issues. If I just say that stat, I say 31% of people have issues with smoking later in life. That is one way of framing my stat. Or I could say, more than 30%. And both of these are true, but this one is framed very differently, right? I'm leaving more to the imagination. If someone reads this, they might think, oh, it could be 35, it could be 36. It's actually just 31, but I haven't lied. Billboards and advertisers will do this all the time. Maybe I'll make the 30% in bold, or I'll put an exclamation mark on the end, or I'll underline it. Well, damn, 30%. This is an example of taking advantage of the framing effect. Another very classic example that everyone's definitely seen is in pricing. So if something's $70 and I want to sell for $70, I'm going to put $69.99 on the price tag, because this is a different way of framing it, even though it is the same thing. I don't really care about the framing effect in terms of how toxic it is. I'm just going to honestly say it's completely fine, partly because I think we all do this so much. I don't see how this would affect a friendship. Alright, the next one is the fundamental attribution error, which is when you judge others on their character, but yourself on the situation. So we have two people here. This is person A, this is from A's point of view, and person B. And let's say person A and person B both do the same thing that's maybe a little bit immoral. I don't know, let's give an example of something that's broadly considered immoral. Like, I don't know, maybe they were both speeding in their car, right? They were both speeding. It's not really that big of a deal, depending on how much you're speeding, but it's a bit immoral probably, right? So they were both speeding. And person A has access to all of person A's thoughts. This person can see their own mind, and so in their head, they can say to themselves, you know, it was worth it. Maybe they had a job interview to get to. It was worth it. It was actually morally okay because of the stakes. They had to get to a job interview, maybe they had to go to the hospital. They're going to come up with some reason why there's an intrinsic factor that meant they had to speed. Now, person A has no access to person B's mind. And so person A might just assume that person B is just a bit of a bad person, right? They're speeding because they were lazy. They've no idea what's going on in person B's mind. The basic idea here is that we're constantly trying to defend our own actions to ourselves and steel manning those defenses. So we're going to feel way more justified in our immoral actions, and we're going to give less of that leeway to other people, especially people we don't like, which I want to talk more about later on. I think this is really toxic. I do think we all do it to an extent, obviously, because we love to moralize ourselves. Nobody wants to feel like they're being a bad person. But this is very much about rating humans differently based on how you perceive them. And yeah, that's obviously really toxic. So we're going to put that in extremely toxic. The placebo effect is a big one. I think the original example would be, you know, some drug that gets claimed to you know, heal some mental issue in a patient, and they take the drug and they believe the drug is going to work, and the drug is actually just sugar water. You know, it's not actually a real drug, but the patient believes that the drug is real. And what ends up happening is that sometimes the patient will report that the drug worked. This is a placebo effect. They think it works because they were told that it worked. The idea is that a lot of this is just in the mind. A lot of it's cognitive. Some people could argue that the placebo effect happens all the time with, you know, superstitions, or even like religious or spiritual beliefs. You could consider those to be placebo effects. They're self-serving, and we really sort of believe they work, even though they might just be equivalent to the sugar water, where they're not actually there. I don't care about this as a trait in my friends. We all get placeboed sometimes. I'm just going to say not a huge deal. Alright, bystander effect. So I think the idea of the bystander effect, from what I remember, is if you've got a group of people, if you've got one person on the street, right? It's good. It's a, you know, regular moral agent, just a normal person. And another person has some accident. Maybe they got mugged. Maybe, let's just say they fell over and they hurt their knee. I don't know. I don't think it actually really matters. They say, ouch. Alright, this hurts for this guy. Now, if no one else is around, it seems very obvious to person A that they should go and help person B. The bystander effect basically says that the more bystanders there are, so we'll add way more people around here, the less likely any one person is to go and help the situation. This happens a lot when a crime occurs and there's only one person who really sees it, who isn't involved. They're probably going to call the cops, right? That's the morally right thing to do here. But if there are like 10 people who see a crime, a lot of them are just going to assume, you know, surely someone else will call the cops, I don't have to. And there have been some really interesting studies that have shown that the bigger the group, the actual less likely there is to have at least one responder to the situation, because everyone passes the responsibility onto somebody else in that group. It's a pretty scary thing to learn, I guess, about humanity, that we all do this. In terms of toxicity, I think generally, you know, wanting to pass on responsibility to other people is quite toxic. Specifically in a friendship, I don't really know how this would play out. Maybe you're at a restaurant and the bill comes or something. I don't know. I'm just gonna put somewhat toxic. Now the next one is the halo effect, which is to do with how we give way more leniences to people that we like. Another big part of this is like pretty privilege. So it's known that if someone's better looking, people are more likely to attribute positive traits to them. But more broadly, if we think about it in a friendship context, it's like if I have two friends, so this is me, and this is friend one, I say F1, and this is friend two, and on different days, they both do the same like vaguely immoral act. They both do a bad thing. But me and friend one are tight. I like this guy. But I'm not too keen on the other guy. I'm like, I'm way more likely to make excuses for this person. And I'm probably not even going to end up thinking they're that bad of a person. Because I like them, I'm so much more willing to steel man what they've done and defend them in my head. But I have no like earthly urge to defend this person in my head. I already wasn't too fussed on him. Maybe I didn't even like him. And so when he does a bad thing, it's just going to reinforce that I don't like him. So ironically, by forgiving this person, I've actually humanized them more because they've made mistakes and stuff, and we're forgiving their mistakes, and they're actually more of like a real human to me now. I'm actually probably going to come out of this liking this person even more. But this person two, I already didn't like him very much, and now he's done an immoral thing. I'm going to like him probably a bit less now. So all the halo effect does is kind of make it so that every time your friends do something, it just tends to polarize how you already see them. If you like someone, you like them more. If you don't like someone, you will not like them more. Obviously, I think this shouldn't happen, and I think it's a problem. And that is toxic, because you should be holding your friends to the same standards, I think. We're going to say extremely toxic, actually. I think this is quite toxic. The next one is reactance, which is wanting to do the opposite of what someone else is trying to make you do. This could be as trivial as like you and your friend are driving somewhere together, you're going to dinner, and they ask you, do you know a good way of going? And you say, yeah, you should go this way. You got to go this way, man. And they say, no, screw you, I'm going to go the other way. Because you really want them to go the way that you said, and for some reason they felt threatened by that. It's like they want to feel like they have autonomy. So if you tell them to do something, they're going to react to that and want to do the opposite. The famous example of, if you don't want a kid to press a red button, the worst thing to say to them is don't press the red button, because it's going to make them really want to push it, because we're defiant by nature, right? Especially in like teenage years. This is reactance. It's annoying in a friend. I don't think it's really that toxic. I find it quite funny actually, and I play a lot of poker, which is something I've said before. So it helps me a lot there. If you can make them think you want them to do something, make them they'll do the opposite. It's cool. So I'm gonna put this in somewhat toxic. The next one is optimism bias, which is just where you overestimate the likelihood of good outcomes. It's pretty wholesome. I don't think it's that big of a deal. It might be a bit annoying, but no, it's not toxic. Pessimism bias is the exact opposite, overestimating the likelihood of bad outcomes. It might make someone a bit more of a drab, make them more uninspiring, harder to be around. More of a depressing ethos or whatever. But I don't think it's toxic. I'm just going to say not a huge deal, I think. Alright, groupthink. This is a big one. Groupthink is when you're in a community of people and the community thinks a certain thing and now you have to think it. There's a big a lot of people in politics will criticize the other side of being groupthink, having a sort of cult-like mindset. But groupthink isn't always that bad. I mean, nationality, I guess, is a form of groupthink. Well, being proud in any identity is, in a sense, a form of groupthink, because you are going to, at some point, try and make yourself more palatable to people around you, because that's what humans do. It's kind of why we have taboos. If someone's breaking taboos all the time, it's not really the fact that they're breaking the taboo that's bad. It's the fact that they've demonstrated that they're willing to break the taboo that's bad. They're sort of protesting the idea of groupthink, and that's what we really don't like. So honestly, this is only really toxic depending on what group it is. So I'll just say it's somewhat toxic. Obviously, like racism and stuff, I think is quite toxic. So that would be a bad form of groupthink. The next one is the self-serving bias, which is where you believe that all your failures are not your fault, but the good stuff is all you. That's that you had control over that stuff. Basically, you earned the good stuff and you didn't deserve the bad stuff. Now, this is very similar to another one that I've spoken about, which is to do with comparing your actions with another friend's actions. This one is a bit different because it's about comparing your good outcomes with your bad outcomes. It can create like this kind of grandiose narrative someone can have that they're infallible or they've got a very high ego because they earned all this stuff. You know, they got a bit of money on them and they think, yeah, I earned all of this, but they refuse to accept that maybe some of it was luck or, you know, the way they were raised. And whenever anything bad happens to them, they think, why is it always me? You know, why does God hate me or something like that? It's pretty toxic, I think. It's very ego-driven. I'm going to put it in very toxic. The next one is the curse of knowledge, which is when once you know something, you presume that it's obvious to everybody. It's going to be quite annoying, especially if the person is quite intelligent and you know they're quite intelligent, because then when they say, oh, it's this, right? You know, everyone knows that it's this. It can make you feel a bit diminished, I suppose, make you feel small because they're acting like this thing that you have no idea about is such common knowledge. It can make you feel quite left out, be quite alienating. So in that sense, it's bad. It's not very thoughtful, I guess. This sort of ties into the whole like theory of mind idea where, you know, kids and we think a lot of animals aren't really conscious of the fact that other people have thoughts different to us. There are really famous tests that they've done on like children to see if they have a theory of mind like this. It's not toxic in itself, but having it can make you annoying to be around. So I'm going to put it in, ultimately, I think not a huge deal. The next one is the base rate fallacy, which is when you ignore the base rates of things and overemphasize specific information. So I'll give an example of this. Let's say you have to solve a problem, and the problem is about this guy, and his name is Todd. And what do we know about Todd? We know that Todd is shy. And that's all we know. And then you have a question where there's two jobs and you've got to guess what job Todd is more likely to have. He is either a sales rep or a librarian. Now, if you had a base rate fallacy, you might think the answer is obviously librarian, because the only information you know about Todd is that he's shy. And you might be overestimating your ability to use this information, because there's going to be way more sales reps than there are librarians in the population. It's true that a higher percentage of librarians are going to be shy, but there are way more sales reps. So let's say maybe this bar represents all the sales reps in the community, and this bar represents all the librarians. And let's say that red means shy and blue means not shy. We could say that for the librarians, most of them are shy, and some of them aren't shy. For the sales reps, a lot less of them are shy, and a lot more of them are not shy. So it's true that if you're a librarian, you're more likely to be shy than not shy, but you can see that there's still way more shy sales reps than there are shy librarians, just on account of there being more sales reps. So the base rate fallacy is that you've ignored the base rate, as in the natural likelihood that these things can happen. Todd is shy. This is good information that he's shy, but something more important is that Todd is human. and humans are more likely to be sales reps. That's Todd's base case, or base rate, I should say. People do this all the time, where they learn new information, and the most recent thing they learned, they put way too much overemphasis on it. So, for example, if a friend maybe makes a joke that isn't funny one time, but it's like the first time you've met them, you're going to put way more emphasis on that and say, oh, they must not be a very funny guy. You know, they've done something unfunny. But there's way more other things that can predict someone being funny over just one joke or one instance of a joke. I don't think it's that toxic though, so we're going to put it in. We're going to put it in completely fine, actually. I really don't think this matters. It's more of a logical fallacy, actually. Probably shouldn't even be in this list. The next one is option paralysis, which is the classic thing that happens when you go to the frozen yogurt store and there's, 500 choices, and it makes you end up taking longer to pick something. Hot take here, I find that indecisiveness in general is actually quite toxic. It can really bother me when I'm hanging out with friends and I'm trying to lead a direction. Maybe I ask them, where do you want to go? Do you want to order food? And they're scrolling the Uber app for 20 minutes. I don't know what I want to get. There's too many options. That can really frustrate me. I'm sort of wary about calling it toxic just because I don't think they're doing it on purpose, even though it does feel like that in the moment, that they're just doing it to piss me off. I'm going to put it as somewhat toxic. I think we have an obligation to our friends to sometimes verbalize our preferences, and sometimes that just means picking something on Uber Eats that maybe you wouldn't have picked if you had another 45 minutes to think. The next one is the gambler's bias, also known as the gambler's fallacy. The basic premise of the gambler's bias is that dice have memory. Dice have memory. Which is a fancy way of saying that events that happened in the past can give you information about what's more likely to happen in the future. So let's say I roll dice and I roll them, I roll it 5 times and I got a 3, I got a 2, I got another 3, and I got a 4. And then someone asks, what's the next roll probably going to be? And somebody might say, well, it's probably going to be like a 6 or a 1 or a 5 because they haven't happened yet. But no, obviously this is wrong, and it's actually just going to be 1 and 6 for everything. Does it matter? Because the dice can't remember what it rolled last time. It's still a 1 in 6 chance. If you've ever been to a casino, you'll notice that roulette tables usually will have a screen that shows the past spins. And you'll get a lot of people staring at the past spins and like studying them and seeing, all right, there were 3 blacks in a row, so the next one has to be red. And a lot of people who play roulette genuinely think that this makes a difference. They're looking up, they go, okay, it's been an even number, then an even number, so an odd number must hit. They say, I'm due for this one. The wheel is due for this number. Obviously, that's not how it works. Because past events have no bearing on the likelihood of present events when they're independent like that. Is it toxic? No, it's not really toxic. I can't think of an example of the gambler's bias being toxic. I mean, having a gambling addiction is toxic, I guess. But for a friend, it's not a huge deal. I've got friends that might have minor gambling problems. We're going to say not a huge deal. I'll put them here. The final one is naive realism, which is the tendency to believe that our perception of the world reflects it exactly as it is, unbiased and unfiltered. I'm trying to think of a good example of this off the top of my head. Let's say you're in a world, I'll keep it in the general form. So you're in the world and you think something's true. You think that P is true, right? Where P is some claim about the world. And you're walking down the street and you see some evidence for P. You see evidence for P. And you see some more evidence for P. And then more evidence. And then you see evidence for Q, which is the opposite of P. And you see evidence for P. And you keep going, you keep going. And it's like, I've got more reason to think P is true than that Q is true, because I've seen more evidence of P. And a naive realist will likely really overestimate this and say, well, P has to 100% be true. It's 100% true. Because the other option is that P is 100% false. They're not really assigning a fair probabilistic weight to the odds of P or Q. They're just picking whatever they think is more likely to be true and then acting like that's 100% true. This is naive realism. The idea that you can basically know what's going on. A much more reasonable approach would be to say, yeah, I think P is probably true. If I had to bet, I'd bet on P. But let's give it like 70% chance of being true, and let's give Q 30% chance of being true. I think this happens a lot with people who say they're very convinced that God's real or that God's not real. But you ask anybody about religion, they're going to give you like one of these 100% or one of these 0% claims. It's definitely true or it's definitely false. I think as humans we should chill out a little bit and maybe just say, yeah, it's probably true, 45%, and we can haggle over what that percent number is. But if someone's saying something's definitely true or definitely false, they're lying to you and themselves, and they're probably trying to sell you something. It's annoying, but I don't know how toxic this is. I'm going to put it in somewhat toxic, because it can be quite frustrating. Cool, and that completes the video. This is my final rating. I won't bother with rating them within the tiers, but I think that the fundamental attribution error is definitely going to be the most toxic one. These two I find it really, these two really bother me in my personal life. I see it all the time. But yeah, I think that's everything. So thanks for watching. Cheers, guys.